Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using the Painted Rose stamp set by Concord 9th, and we're going to be coloring it white. Well, it won't really be white, but it will appear white. So I'm going ahead and using my Misty here to stamp this onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I did use my Misty here just in case I needed to stamp it twice. This is a pretty huge image. It's pretty much the only thing you need on your card panel. And I'm stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is a Copic safe ink and does give a really crisp impression. So once I had that stamped out, we're going to go ahead and move on to the coloring of the flower itself. And I want my flower to appear to be white, but anything that is white still has shading, so nothing is truly white. So I'm laying out my lightest color, which is a C1, and just mapping out where my shadows will be. And then going in with my darkest color, which is the C7, and I'm just putting this in the very darkest areas. So pretty much where this petal is laying underneath that other petal. And also there's little lines within this image. So I'm just doing a little tiny triangle right over top of that little line. Then I will go in with my C5, and I'm flicking out in certain areas and then pretty much just going over the line that we had created for the shadow. And I'll also make that little triangle a little bit wider and a little bit longer. Do the same thing with my C3, then go in with my C1. And here's where I'm doing all flicks with my C1, but I'm pretty much fading out to white with the exception of that little triangle that we built. For this next petal, I'm doing the same thing, laying out my lightest color where my darkest areas will be, and going in with my C7, and I'm just putting a line in that very darkest area. Next, I'll go in with my C5, and I'm just pushing this color out a little bit. I'm not necessarily doing any kind of flicks. I'm just kind of pushing that out. Doing that same thing with the C3, just pushing that color out just a little bit further. I also added just a little bit of shading to the tip of the petal with just my C3. I didn't want to make that too dark, but it does appear that this petal is a little bit folded over. So my highlight will be right there in the center instead of the top of the petal. I'll go ahead and show you one more petal here, and then I'll kind of speed things up. Again, going in with my lightest color. Now for this one, the petal is kind of folded over on itself, I guess. So I'm not going to be adding too much of my C7 here because there's not much of an area to work with, but I am putting my shading in the same area as far as the petal being underneath that other one, but I'm also putting just a line where it's folded over on itself, where it would create a shadow on itself. Going back down to my C3 and my C1, and again flicking that out to white. Now I'll go ahead and speed everything up here by quite a bit, but I pretty much did the same thing with all of these petals. Some of them are kind of shaped differently, and sometimes you kind of have to take a look at the image itself to kind of see how these petals are supposed to be shaped, and that will affect the way you color them. There were a few that I added a little bit of shading to the tips just to make it appear a little bit more round. Now also when you go from your C1 and fade that off to white, you can certainly go down to a C0 if you own one. I don't own one, so I have to kind of make do with what I have at this point. So what I do in order to get rid of some of those flick marks that we created with that C3, I just go in with my colorless blender very quickly. I don't, press it down on the paper too much, but I go from the opposite direction. So I'll go from the edge of the petal in, and I'll do small little flicks, and it will kind of look a little bit muddy when you first do it, just because the colorless blender is just basically leaving alcohol on your paper. So the color that you're seeing is probably just the alcohol itself. It's making your paper a little bit wet. Make sure you let that dry before you add anything else to it, because it will alter the way it will look and kind of it's a little scary sometimes thinking you ruined it, but just give it a minute or so to dry. Alcohol inks, whether it be from a marker or any other alcohol inks that you may use, as you're probably all aware, they do dry pretty quickly. So for these petals, you can see I did those little triangles where those little lines were within the image. And for this little tiny one here, I'm not adding all that much shading here because it's such a light area. Here's another petal here that's kind of folded over on itself, and I'm doing my shading the same way as I did that first one that I showed you in real time. I'm doing 2 or 3 petals at one time now just to kind of speed things up for myself, but I am using the same color combination. I just kind of vary the amounts that I use, especially of the darkest color. There's some petals that I barely put any C7, if at all, and then there's others that the petal would naturally be a little bit darker than the rest, so I added a little bit more of my C7 and C5 than I maybe did for some of the others. Now for this petal, the tip of it is folded over on itself, so there would be a shadow on the petal itself from where it's folded over, but I didn't go in with my C7 for this. I started with my C5 just because I didn't want that shadow to be all that dark, or else my whole petal would end up gray and I wouldn't have any white space at all. Now for the center part of the flower, this area would naturally be darker because the petals are smaller and they're closer together. So for example, a rose bud would naturally be darker just because there'd be more shadows. So like always, I'm going in with my lightest color and mapping out those areas. And for this larger one that's kind of wrapped around the entire bud in the middle, there would be more darker areas because there'd be so many shadows cast on it. So I was pretty heavy-handed with my C7 and my C5, but I did end up maintaining a little bit of white space there. Now for these teeny tiny petals, I'm not adding a C7 to all of them, and if I am, it's just a teeny tiny bit, but I'm just going in with the same colors, but there's going to be very little white space in the center. Next, we'll move on to the leaves, and I'm going to be using my YG90 markers here, and again, starting with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas. I want these petals to kind of make it appear as if the middle of them, where not the stem, but the veins, I guess, are kind of caved in. So I'm concentrating my darkest areas being right there in the center of the leaf, as well as where it would be underneath the rose. Then going in with my darkest mid-tone color, and I'm just thickening up that line that we had created on both sides, not just one. Going in with my YG95, doing that same thing, just thickening up that line and extending those flicks out a little bit further, and then finally going back in with my lightest color. Now, this looks like a gray rose. It doesn't look like a white rose at this point. So I wanted to have a dark background, and I wanted it to appear black. So first what I did is I trimmed down my panel a little bit. I want to have a border on my card base, or from my card base, I guess, and I didn't want to use all my Copic ink up. So I'm starting off with my black marker. First, I went in my colorless blender and cleaned up some of those flick lines that we were talking about earlier. Then I'll go in with my black marker. This is the 100 marker. Now you want to make sure that if you're going to do a background like this, that your markers are nice and filled. It will make the blending a lot easier, and you're going to be using a lot of it. So I started by just going around my image, and I'm kind of using the side of my nib here, but just being careful not to go over my image itself. Once I had the outline done of my image, I realized that I wanted it to be have a little bit more black, true black. So I ended up going over the image again and just kind of making that line a little bit wider. Once I had my black marker down, I didn't want the background to be completely black. I did want there to be a little bit of shading, but naturally the darkest area of the background would be directly around the image itself. That would cast a shadow, I guess you could say. Once I had the black down, I moved to my C7, And I'm starting my lines here, and I'm using the side of my nib again, where my black, just before where my black ends, and extending that out a little bit further. Now, sometimes you may have to go over it once or twice more just to get a better blend so that you don't see the transition from the black to the C7. Again, you can start with the C9, which is a lot closer to black. But once again, I don't have the C9, so I make do with what I have. Then I'll go in with the C5 marker, and I'm doing the same thing here, going over the areas a few times just to get a better blend. And I was originally going to go on to my C3, but realized that that was probably going to be too light. I wanted my background to be extremely dark to make that flower appear to be white. So I ended up covering up my entire panel with my C5 and kind of going over some of these areas a few times just to make sure that these areas blended from the black to the C7 to the C5. And some of the areas I did go over a couple of times just so that I didn't get those streaky marks that sometimes you get with alcohol markers. The more you go over that, the smoother it will appear. I did let this dry for just a few minutes because, like I said, even though alcohol inks dry fast, it's hard to tell what it's really going to look like until it's completely dry. Next, I took one of the sentiments from that same stamp set, and I'm going to go ahead and white heat emboss this in the top left-hand corner. So I treated my card panel there with my anti-static tool, stamped my sentiment with Versamark ink, sprinkle on some Hero Arts white embossing powder, and heat set that. Now this is where I realized I cut my panel just a little bit too small, so I ended up layering this onto a piece of black cardstock that's just slightly larger than this, but smaller than my card base itself. And I stuck all of my panels together with Tampomono multi-glue. Last, I took some sequins, and I purchased these sequins off of Instagram, one of the girls that I follow on Instagram. She's got beautiful sequin mixes, so I'll link her page below just in case you're interested, as well as all of the other supplies that I used on today's card. But I popped these onto my card panel with my glossy accents and just put a little bit in the center as well, just to make sure that these don't move around in the mail. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.